Picture yourself standing on a flat plain in southern Arizona. Nothing around you but low brush and the shimmer of heat rising off the ground. And then, out of that emptiness, a wall of earth, climbing higher than a modern three-story house. It should not be standing. It is made not of stone, not of fired brick, but of the desert itself, packed and layered by hand. And it has weathered more than 6 centuries of blistering summers and sudden desert storms out in the open air, with no roof to protect it for most of that time. That is the Casa Grande. And the first thing you need to understand is that when Europeans found it, it was already ancient, already a ruin, already a mystery to the very people living nearby. The builders were long gone, and they had left no writing, no inscription, no name carved into the walls. What they left was the structure itself, standing alone, and a set of questions that we are still trying to answer. There are 2 threads to this story, and they pull in different directions. On one side, there is the deep human memory of the desert, the oral tradition carried by the earthen peoples who farmed these lands, a memory that speaks of those who came before them and of the great houses they built. On the other side, there is the material evidence, the walls themselves, the caliche earth hardened into something that behaves almost like modern concrete, the deliberate openings aligned with the sun and moon, the vast network of irrigation canals stretching across the valley. And the question that sits at the center of all of it, the one we are going to follow to the end, is this. Who built this tower? How did they master a building material and a level of planning that seems to run ahead of what we expect from them? And why, after centuries of success, did they abandon it all and disappear from the record? To get there, we are going to walk through what the earthen traditions actually say and how they name the people who came before. We are going to read the first written account, left by a Jesuit priest in the 1690s. We are going to look closely at the walls themselves and at what makes caliche so strange a choice, so difficult to work, and yet so durable. We are going to examine the astronomical alignments and ask whether they are intention or coincidence. And we are going to sit with the hardest question of all, the one the archaeologists themselves still argue over. Because the truth here is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is has stopped looking. Long before any priest arrived, before any surveyor drew a line across this desert, people were living here and farming here in a way that should have been impossible. This is the Sonoran Desert, one of the harshest environments in North America, where summer temperatures climb past the point most crops can survive, and rain is a rare and violent thing. And yet, for well over 1,000 years, a farming people thrived here. We call them the Hohokam, though that is not a name they gave themselves. The word comes from the O'odham language, and it is usually translated as something close to those who are gone or those who have vanished. Think about that for a moment. The name we use for these people is not a name at all. It is a description of their absence. It is the desert's way of saying they were here and then they were not. What the Hohokam did in this valley is, by any honest measure, an engineering achievement of the first rank. To farm this land, they dug canals. Not small ditches, but a system of main canals and branching feeders that carried water from the rivers out across the desert floor for miles. The scale is genuinely hard to grasp. Across the region, archaeologists have mapped hundreds of miles of these canals, some of them large enough to move serious volumes of water. All of it dug by hand, with stone and wood tools. And all of it engineered with enough understanding of grade and slope that the water actually flowed where they needed it to go. Dig the channel too steep and it erodes and destroys itself. Dig it too shallow and the water sits and goes stagnant and never reaches the fields. They got it right, and they got it right at a scale that supported towns across generations in a desert. This was not a lucky accident. This was accumulated knowledge, refined and passed down. And this is exactly why I want you to set aside, right now, any lazy picture of these people as simple. The men and women who planned those canals were surveyors and hydraulic engineers, whether or not they would have used those words. They read the land. They understood water. And when the time came to build the great houses, the same intelligence that shaped the canals shaped the walls. The O'odham peoples who live in this region today, the Akimel O'odham and the Tohono O'odham, carry oral traditions that reach back toward those earlier builders. And to be careful and honest here, these traditions are complex, they vary, and they should not be flattened into a single tidy story to suit a documentary. But what runs through them is a memory of ancestors and predecessors on this land, of great houses, and in some tellings, of conflict and upheaval and departure. To the people who carried these stories, the Casa Grande was not a curiosity. It was connected to who they were. This is the point I keep coming back to on this channel. Oral tradition is not a fairy tale told to children. It is a form of memory, carried by voice across generations, and it often preserves things that no document ever recorded. If you enjoy the stories the textbooks quietly walk past, the ones that live in the ground and in the memory of a people, this is the channel that lives on them. So consider subscribing before we go further, because here is where the two threads begin to cross. We are going to look at what the first European to write it down actually said, at what the walls are physically made of and why that matters so much, at the alignments carved into the upper floor and whether they were planned, and at the question that haunts the whole site, which is why a people this capable would build all of this and then leave. To understand what troubles the historians, we have to go to the summer of 1694 and to a man named Eusebio Kino. Kino was a Jesuit missionary, an Italian by birth, and by any standard, a remarkable figure. A mapmaker, an explorer, a man who traveled thousands of miles across this frontier on horseback. When he rode up to the Casa Grande, he became the first European to document it in writing. And his reaction is worth sitting with, because it is the reaction of an educated man of his time confronting something he could not place. He described it as a large structure, a great house, 4 stories tall, its walls thick and made of earth, and he recorded that he celebrated Mass within its walls. He asked the local people who had built it, and the answer he received pointed to those who had come before, ancestors of the desert people, long departed. Now hold on to a few specific things from Kino's account, because they anchor everything that follows. First, the height, 4 stories. In an age with no cranes, no steel, no fired brick technology of the European kind, these builders raised a structure whose central portion still stands taller than a 3-story building today, and it was taller still when it was whole. Second, the material. Kino noted it was earth, not stone. That single detail is the heart of the engineering puzzle, and we are going to come straight back to it. And third, and this is crucial, even in 1694, this was already a ruin. Already old, already abandoned. The people Kino spoke to were not its builders and did not claim to be. The gap between the building of it and the finding of it was already centuries wide. So let us look at that material, because this is where the story stops being just an old ruin and becomes genuinely strange. The walls of the Casa Grande are built from caliche. Caliche is a naturally occurring desert soil, a mix of sand, clay, and calcium carbonate, the same mineral family as limestone. In its natural state, it forms a hard crust in the ground, and it is a miserable material to work with. It is heavy, it is dense, and it does not shape easily. The builders did not carve blocks from it and stack them like bricks. Instead, the evidence in the walls shows they mixed the caliche into a workable mass and laid it up in courses, great horizontal layers, letting each layer dry and harden before adding the next. You can still see those layers in the walls today if you look, the lines where one course met the next. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you. This is a load-bearing structure made of packed desert earth that is stood in the open, exposed to sun and rain and centuries of temperature swings for something on the order of 600 years or more. Think about what that means. Ordinary mud will not do that. Ordinary earthen construction, left unprotected, slumps and dissolves and washes back into the ground within a generation or two. But the calcium carbonate in caliche behaves differently. When it is worked correctly, it sets and hardens towards something with the resilience of a weak concrete. The Hohokam, without any written chemistry, without any of the theory we would use to describe what is happening at the mineral level, had learned to select and prepare a local material so that it would set into a durable, weather-resistant mass. By experiment, by observation, by generations of trial and correction, they had arrived at a working knowledge of a material that behaves like concrete, centuries before anything we would recognize as concrete engineering reached this continent. I want to be careful and precise here, because this is exactly where responsible history and sensational nonsense part ways. This is not Roman concrete. It is not some lost supermaterial handed down from a vanished super-civilization. It is caliche, prepared with skill, and its durability comes from real, understandable chemistry in the local soil. But that does not shrink the achievement. It deepens it. Because it means ordinary human beings, working with what the desert gave them, figured out how to make Earth stand up like stone. And they did it well enough that we are still standing under their walls today. And once you accept the material, you have to face the next layer, the one that is harder to dismiss and harder to explain. Because it is not just that the walls endure, it is where the holes in them point. Now, the skeptical position deserves a fair and full hearing, because it is the responsible starting point. And the skeptic says this: be careful with alignments. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. And if you take any large building with multiple openings and enough walls, you can find some line, some hole, some corner that happens to point at something in the sky on some special day. The sun rises and sets somewhere every single morning. Give me enough windows and enough dates, and I will find you a coincidence. This is a real and serious objection, and any honest look at the Casa Grande has to pass through it. Archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient people built the sky into their structures, is a field littered with claims that fell apart the moment someone checked them properly. So the burden of proof sits, correctly, on anyone claiming intention. But here is where it does not stay simple. On the upper floor of the Casa Grande, there are specific openings, small holes and windows set into the thick walls. And researchers who have studied the structure have noted that certain of these openings appear to align with significant solar and lunar events. One opening is often cited in connection with the setting sun at the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, when the sun reaches its northernmost point on the horizon. Others have been discussed in relation to lunar standstills, a slower and far more subtle cycle in the moon's movement that repeats only across roughly 18.5 years. And that lunar detail is the one that gives me pause, because catching a solstice is one thing, but building an opening that frames an event tied to an 18-year lunar cycle is not something you stumble into by accident. To even know that cycle exists, you have to have watched the moon carefully and recorded what you saw across the better part of 2 decades. Now, I have to be honest with you about the state of the evidence, because that honesty is the whole point. Not every claimed alignment at the Casa Grande is equally solid. Some are well regarded and taken seriously by researchers. Others are more contested, the kind of thing where the skeptic's warning about coincidence has real force. There is genuine debate here, and I am not going to pretend it is settled. But step back and look at the wider picture, because context is everything. This is a farming people whose entire survival depended on the calendar. If you live in a desert and everything you eat comes from irrigated fields, then knowing when the seasons turn, when to plant, when the rains might come, when the longest and shortest days fall, is not idle astronomy. It is life and death. A people who could engineer miles of canals with correct water grade were not people who ignored the sky. They watched it because they had to. So consider the two possibilities side by side, fairly. It is possible that some of the alignments at the Casa Grande are the kind of coincidence the skeptic warns about, patterns we impose on a large, old building after the fact. That is a real possibility, and I will not wave it away. But it is also entirely possible, and I would argue more consistent with everything else we know about these people, that at least some of those openings were placed with intention, by builders who understood the sky well enough to fold a calendar into a wall. And the moment you take that second possibility seriously, the Casa Grande stops being just a large house. It becomes an instrument, a structure that does not only shelter, but observes, a building that watches the year go by and tells its keepers where they stand in it. And that reframes the entire structure, because now you are not looking at a farmhouse that happens to be tall. You're looking at something closer to a civic and ceremonial building, a landmark at the heart of a community, possibly serving as a place of observation, of gathering, of keeping time for a whole people. Which raises the sharpest question of all. If this was that important, if it took that much knowledge and labor and coordination to raise, then why is it empty? Why did the people who understood the walls and read the sky and dug the canals simply put it all down and go? Here is the part the record tries to bury, and it is time to say it plainly. Sometime in the 1400s, roughly a century and a half before Father Kino ever arrived, the Hohokam way of life came apart. The great settlements were abandoned. The canals fell silent and began to fill with sand. The making of the great houses stopped, and the knowledge that built them, the material knowledge of caliche, the engineering of water, the reading of the sky, was not written down anywhere, because these people did not write. It lived in the minds and hands of the people who held it, and when the way of life ended, that knowledge had nowhere to go. Now here is the trap I want us to avoid, because it is the trap that produces bad history. It is tempting to say the people vanished, to make it a spooky disappearance, an empty settlement with the fires still warm. That is not what the evidence shows, and it would be dishonest to imply it. The people did not evaporate. The most careful and widely held understanding among archaeologists today is that the Hohokam did not disappear as human beings at all. They are, in all likelihood, the ancestors of the Otham peoples who still live in this region. What ended was not the bloodline. What ended was the system, the concentrated, canal-fed, great house-building society. The people persisted. The civilization, in that particular form, dissolved. But that only sharpens the real mystery and moves it, because now the question is not where did the people go, it is what broke the system so completely that a people who had thrived here for over 1,000 years abandoned their towers, their canals, and their whole way of building within a few generations. And here the honest answer is that we do not have one single certain cause. We have candidates, and they may well have worked together. There is strong evidence in the tree ring and flood records of severe climate swings in this period. Long droughts that would have starved the canals, punctuated by violent floods that could tear those same canals apart. Picture the cruelty of that combination. You survive the drought that nearly kills you, and then the flood that finally comes destroys the very system you depend on to catch it. There are also signs of social strain, of stress within these crowded settlements, the kind of internal fracture that can bring down a society already pushed to its edge by the land itself. And this is where the Ootham oral traditions and the physical evidence quietly reach toward the same shape, because some of those traditions carry memory of upheaval, of conflict, of the abandonment of the great houses. For a long time, those stories were dismissed by outsiders as mere legend. But when you lay them beside what the soil and the tree rings and the ruined canals are telling us, they stop sounding like invention. They start sounding like memory, a memory of a hard ending, carried by voice across the exact centuries when the written record is silent. Line it all up, and the picture, though still incomplete, comes into focus. The scale of the canals, the mastery of caliche, the alignments in the walls, the sudden silence in the 15th century. Put together, they do not describe a magic vanished race. They describe a real, sophisticated, deeply knowledgeable farming people, pushed past their limits by a shifting climate and their own accumulated pressures, whose specialized knowledge died not with the people, but with the system that held it. The hands survived, the way of using them did not. So what actually built the Casa Grande, and why did the knowledge vanish? After everything we have laid out, it is finally possible to say it, and both answers turn out to be the same story. The Casa Grande was built by the ancestors of the Ootham, the people we call the Hohokam, a farming civilization that engineered its way to survival in one of the harshest deserts on the continent. They built it out of caliche, a local earth they had learned, through generations of patient trial, to prepare so that it set and hardened toward the durability of concrete. They raised it 4 stories tall without cranes or steel or a single word of written engineering. And they built at least some of it, the evidence strongly suggests, to watch the sky, folding the turning of the year into openings in its upper walls. And it was lost for the simplest and most human reason there is. This was knowledge that lived in people, not in books. It was carried in the hands of the canal builders, in the eyes of the sky watchers, in the practiced judgment of whoever knew exactly how wet the caliche had to be before you laid the next course. There was no manual, there was no archive, there was only a living chain of teaching, one generation to the next. And when the climate turned savage, and the canals failed, and the great settlements broke apart, that chain snapped. The people scattered into a different, more dispersed way of life, one that did not need great houses or vast canals. And within a few generations, the specific knowledge of how to build like this was simply gone. Not stolen, not hidden, not forbidden, just no longer passed on, because there was no longer a world that used it. Let me be honest about the edges of what we know, because that honesty is the point of everything we do here. We do not have every step of how the caliche was prepared. We cannot prove the intention behind every single opening in those walls. We do not have one certain, agreed cause for the collapse of the Hohokam system, and serious researchers still argue the details. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the one that leaves the fewest loose ends, that respects the physical evidence, that respects the oral memory of the Oatham, and that does not have to reach for anything beyond human beings to account for a human achievement. And that is the quiet weight of the Casa Grande. It is not the relic of some lost super race. It is something far more moving and far more real. It is ordinary human brilliance, worked out by hand in a desert, powerful enough to raise a tower that outlasted the civilization that made it, and fragile enough to be forgotten in the space of a few generations. The people who could read that sky and shape that earth were, in these things, not behind us at all, and history very nearly forgot to write their names down. In fact, it did. We do not even know what they called themselves, but the answer is not really where this story ends, because what the Casa Grande tells us about ourselves is the part that lingers, long after the facts settle. We like to imagine that knowledge only moves in one direction, always forward, always accumulating, a straight line from primitive to advanced. The Casa Grande is a quiet four-story argument that this is not true. Here was a body of real, hard-won knowledge, the engineering of water, the chemistry of a desert soil, the patient reading of the moon across an 18-year cycle, and it did not pass onward and upward into something greater. It ended. It hit a wall of drought and flood and upheaval, and it stopped, and it was lost. Not because the people were foolish, but because knowledge that lives only in living memory is always one broken generation away from silence. And that should sit with you, because it is not really a story about the past. Everything you know how to do, every skill your hands hold, exists only because someone before you chose to pass it on, and someone before them in an unbroken chain reaching back into the dark. The moment that chain breaks, the knowledge is gone, no matter how brilliant, no matter how essential it once was. The Oatham are still here, the descendants of the builders, and they carry what survived. But the specific art that raised this tower did not survive, and no one alive can fully reconstruct it. A whole way of knowing, held in human hands for 1,000 years, thinned to a ruin standing alone in the brush. Go back to where we started, to that impossible wall rising out of the flat, empty desert. 4 stories of hardened earth that has no business still standing. When we began, it looked like a puzzle, maybe even like the work of some vanished mystery. Look at it again now. It is not a mystery of who or what. It is a monument to how. A monument to human ingenuity and to human forgetting, standing side by side in the same wall. An empire can rise and fall and leave less behind than a single piece of knowledge passed carefully from one hand to the next. And nothing is more fragile than that handing on. So here is the question I want to leave with you, and I genuinely want your answer. What knowledge do you think we are quietly losing right now, in our own time, without even noticing it going? Some skill, some craft, some way of understanding the world that is thinning out to just a few pairs of hands. Tell me in the comments, because those conversations are half the reason I make these. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the achievements the textbooks reduce to a single, dull line, then subscribe, because there are stranger and quieter ones still to come, and this is the only way you will catch them. If it held you all the way to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find these forgotten places, and that is the whole reason a channel like this can keep going. Thank you for standing under these walls with me. Keep asking how the quiet ruins were built, and who forgot how. I will see you at the next one.